We're going to be joined in the next segment by Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, the person that they were able to keep out of Australia. They essentially stopped her tour of Australia. She wanted to talk about informed consent. They don't want to hear that. She wanted to talk about the safety and efficacy of vaccines in Australia. They don't want to hear that either. First, they tried to bar her from the country. Do they do that with Islamic jihadists? Or they keep imams out? That would be politically incorrect. But it's okay to shut somebody down when they're talking about an informed patient-doctor relationship, when they're talking about the safety and the efficacy, and when they're talking about stopping mandatory health care treatment. It's not just enough in this country where we have the Fourth Amendment that recognizes our right to be secure in our persons. It's not just enough for them to put their hands on us. They now assert that they're going to be able to insert chemicals into us, and we're not allowed to question what that is. We should be questioning that. We have a New York University professor who questioned it. He's uncovered the fact that the FDA systematically covers up fraud and misconduct in drug trials. So that's called regulatory capture. That's the phrase. It's a very common thing that happens where you create these government agencies that are supposed to regulate industries or companies or whatever. Instead, they wind up being a tool of what they're supposed to regulate. They wind up being bought by those people. Regulatory capture. How does it work for the FDA? Well, they point out in the article, this is, they say the FDA has shown a pattern of buying into the details of misconduct. Nobody ever finds out what data is bogus, which experiments are tainted, which drugs might be on the market under false pretenses. The FDA has repeatedly hidden evidence of scientific fraud, not just from the public, but also from its most trusted scientific advisors, even as they were deciding whether or not a new drug should be allowed on the market. Even a congressional panel investigating a case of fraud regarding a dangerous drug couldn't get forthright answers. Yeah, we see this all the time, of course. We can't have the congressmen see what the FAA is planning to do with their new regulations, what the FCC is planning to do to the internet. We can't see what this trans-Pacific or transatlantic partnership that's being negotiated by corporate lobbyists of the biggest multinational companies. We can't see what's in that. We just have to pass it so we can find out what's in it, like we did with Obamacare. And people are finding out what's in that, and they don't like it. Not even the Democrats like that. Of course, we now have to just put the vaccines in our bodies so we can find out what's in them. This is an article from Slate, and they say, reading the FDA's inspection files feels almost like watching a highlights reel from a Scientists Gone Wild video. They say they find faked X-ray reports, forged retinal scans, phony lab tests, secretly amputated limbs, all done in the name of science when researchers thought nobody was watching. And they say, well, of course, you're going to find, it's not shocking that you find misconduct, okay? Misconduct happens. It's like what Frank Serpico said about the police. He said you're going to have in any segment of society, whether you're talking about scientists or policemen on the streets, you're going to have people that do the wrong thing. You're going to have criminal activity. The question, though, is will the system purge that criminal activity or will it accept it? Because when you accept it, the system becomes criminal. You become the accessory to the crime. You encourage the crime. Well, there's what the FDA did. They say what's shocking is not that this happened. What's shocking is what the FDA did. When the FDA finds scientific fraud or misconduct, the agency doesn't notify the public, the medical establishment, or even the scientific community that the results of a medical experiment are not to be trusted. On the contrary, for more than a decade, the FDA has shown a pattern of burying the details of misconduct. They say they have things like 483s, establishment inspection reports, worst-case warning letters. They redact it and put it out. It's like the NSA. As we've been saying, our government no longer believes in transparency of any way, shape, or form. They're not going to show us the studies. They're not going to show us the experiments. In fact, if they even did it, because it doesn't support what they want to do. They've been captured by the corporations.
Do you understand how dark it is? How far down the line we are? How late it is?
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. Joining us now is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Dr. Tenpenny is respected as one of the country's most knowledgeable and outspoken physicians regarding the impact of vaccines on health. She is an outspoken advocate for free choice in healthcare. What a novel idea, free choice in healthcare. We hear people talking about free choice. Most of the quote-unquote pro-choice people, the only choice they want to give you is to whether or not you want to abort your unborn child, because most of those same people are screaming at the top of their lungs for mandated vaccines. They could care less about your choice. Well, you know what? We do have a choice. We do have a free choice. Dr. Tenpenny is also an expert on women's breast health and the use of iodine for disease. Her website is tenpennyimc.com. And before I go to her, as I pointed out earlier in the show, we had these reports as she was going to speak in Australia. They tried to bar her from coming into the country. Then, when that didn't work, they started phoning in bomb threats to the venues where she was going to be speaking. We had headlines, doctor educating public on vaccines, receiving bomb threats, and cancels tours. That was 1 week after they had suffered from these different threats. So there's something there that they don't want you to hear. When we question the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, whether or not they're effective, rather than responding to that question, they act as our government always does. And that is, if you expose criminal action in the government, they come after you as the criminal. They try to put you in jail. They threaten to assassinate you. You get suicided. That's what our government always does. That's what they're doing with the vaccines. They don't address the issues that we have there. So the question is, what is it that they're trying to hide by attacking the messenger? Well, in this case, the messenger is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Tenpenny.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
I am really interested to know, and I'm sure our listeners are as well, what was this scary message that was so important that they kept you out of Australia?
It was a really interesting thing. It started out as a trip, just as a holiday, as a vacation. And then I met Miss Stephanie Messenger, who is from Australia. And she said, while you're here, would you like for me to set up a few speaking venues for you? I said, yeah, that would be kind of fun. And I would be able to go to a couple of more cities than what I was originally planning to do. So she set up venues in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Gold Coast. And it was going to be just probably a couple hundred people, more likely than not, kind of speaking to the choir, people that knew me from Facebook or maybe from this show or from coast to coast, and just get to know some people locally. I got my plane ticket, got my visa, and then on January the 4th, there was this big blow up in the Daily Telegraph and in the Daily News and on the Guardian, and all the radio shows from Australia started calling me. And the first radio show I did was the largest radio show in Sydney. And the gentleman asked me at the end of the radio interview, he said, "Were you really surprised at the big blowback from all the media that was down here who didn't want you to come and said that you were a menace to public health, and they labeled you as a public health terrorist? They were making appeals and setting up surveys in order to get the public health department to revoke my visa." He said, "Were you rather surprised at that?" And I said, "Very surprised. I've been to Australia before. I think it's a great country." And I was very surprised at the way they reacted, because the truth is, I would have spoken to about 1,500 people over the course of 3 weekends, quietly gotten on my plane and come back to the United States. And who would have even known I was there except a few hundred people that probably were like-minded anyways? You are the people that made it truly into an international incident in all of the mainstream media in Australia, Canada, and the UK. I was doing interviews in all of those places, all across the US. And now millions and millions and millions of more people are aware of the fact that vaccines can cause problems, that Australia really doesn't have freedom of speech. And not only do they not have freedom of speech, they really don't have freedom of hearing either. They don't want their citizens to know. Yes,
that's the key thing, that we have to want our freedom of speech. We have to, as you point out, a freedom of hearing. We not only have to want to know to be informed, we have to want to be informed. And of course, we are going to lose that right along with many other rights that we have lost if we don't demand those rights. And we cannot allow them to turn us into guinea pigs, into slaves. And that's what we will be if we allow them to force any kind of medical treatment on us. Vaccines are a large part of that. And it's amazing to me, Dr. Tenpenny, that they're rolling this thing out over something that I had as a childhood disease, and we never considered measles to be life-threatening, or mumps.
Well, there's a couple things I'd like to say about that. One is, I got an email from someone in Australia that I thought just summed it up very well, when they said, it's okay to question as long as you don't disagree. And I think that's where we're headed. And so now we can't even, it's okay to say our vaccine's unsafe. We can ask that question as long as we go ahead and get vaccinated anyways. And we are really heading down the path. Like you said, most people over the age of 50 had measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, pertussis. They went through a couple of weeks of being uncomfortable with a rash and a fever and some runny nose and scratchy eyes. And as long as they were well nourished and in our country had plenty of vitamin A. In fact, the World Health Organization policy was always, when they did vaccination campaigns for the measles vaccines, even in third world countries, that previously they would go into these villages and give very high doses of vitamin A for 2 days before the shot. The vitamin A at very high levels, like 400,000 units a day for 2 days. And the reason for that is that the vitamin A would protect from the viral insult from the vaccine, and the viruses in the vaccine incorporate the vitamin A into their shell and their coat, and that keeps any sort of disease or illness from happening. And even children that had measles, if they got vitamin A, it shortened up the illness by many days, and they didn't have any serious outcomes. So back when you and I were of the age of that, measles was very prevalent and chickenpox was very prevalent. These were considered diseases of inconvenience. There's been lots of things that have been on the internet about like the Brady Bunch video that's out there that shows that all the kids had measles and had to stay home from schools, and it was just so inconvenient, and they sat around playing card games because they had to miss school. It was never a big deal. And
no, we had parents would send us down to our neighbors. We've talked about this many times. Everybody our age knows that they found out that somebody down the street had measles. They would send you down and hang out and play with them so that you could get the measles. What they didn't do, Dr. Tenpenny, was to send me down and get the measles from Johnny, and then send me to Sally's house and get the mumps, and then send me to Joe's house and get rubella, and continue on and on and on, which is the other part of this, the massive multiple vaccinations. As Dr. Wakefield pointed out, they had a drop in autism when they stopped giving the MMR shots in Japan, and then it went up again. And they were puzzled by this. What's going on? Then he realized that in practice, what they were doing was giving all three of these separate vaccine shots together on the same day. They had seen a drop when they separated the shots out, spaced them out. When they gave them all on the same day, they saw the autism rate go back up.
And that's what's happening now. As recently as 1985, there really were only 3 vaccines. There was the MMR vaccine, the DPT, which is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, and a polio vaccine that has 3 different polio antigens in it. As recently as 1985, it was only those 3 vaccines. We would spread them apart. We wouldn't give them all together. Probably a lot of the kids didn't even get the whole series. And then in 1991 is when the big ramp up started, when they added hepatitis B at birth. They added the Hib vaccine at 2 months of age, and then they continued to add vaccines along the way till now children get 49 doses of 15 different vaccines by the time they start kindergarten. And then when they add in the teen vaccines, the pertussis booster, the Gardasil, the meningitis vaccine, that by the time kids are now 18 and they get flu shots every year and they get tetanus boosters, that they get over 69 doses of 16 different vaccines. And so I don't know how even a slightly thinking person could look at that and say that was harmless and it was good for you and it was a must. And these vaccine mandates that are coming down the road are very serious, because it's not only about forcing parents to get vaccines that are currently in the vaccine schedule that perhaps they don't want, but there are more than 200 vaccines in the schedule right now in the pipeline, most of them being targeted towards adolescents and adults. And for the pharmaceutical industry to have those protected, they have to be on the childhood vaccination schedule. So if we lose our right to refuse now, and a right to refuse a flu shot in exchange for a job, or any sort of vaccines in order to go to a public education, what's going to happen in another couple of years is, as all these additional vaccines roll down the pipeline, we won't have the ability to refuse those either.
You know, it's not very good for the people of our country, but of course it is very good for the pharmaceutical companies.
Absolutely.
Second quarter of last year, we had a list of the big companies that paid 0 taxes. Guess who was at the top of that list? Merck. $2 billion in 1 quarter of profits, no taxes. And of course, number 2 under them was Seagate, that we just found out has a lot of infections inside their hard disk drives that are probably related to the NSA, but still, it's a large part of this is about the money. And I'm concerned, Dr. Tenpenny, because as we saw the Ebola scare this last fall, as we saw people being brought in by the CDC, by the American government that had Ebola, that they were not taking proper care because this disease was transmitted to people who were following the procedures of the CDC. Nevertheless, they still caught this disease. They were talking about the pharmaceutical drugs that they were creating, the synthetics that they were creating to and they had not had these things evaluated. They were saying, we're going to have to get to the position, if it's not this outbreak, there's going to be an outbreak in the future where we're not going to have time to even pretend to do any testing. They pretend that these vaccines are tested, but they don't give us the information on it. I'm concerned that they're going to have a outbreak. They're going to say, we haven't had time to evaluate this, but we think it works, and they're going to force everybody to take whatever it is. That's a very, very dangerous situation.
They've already set the laws in place for that. That started back in 1986 with the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which it's way past time for that to be repealed. Yes. Because if the drug companies are going to make us take all the risk of the vaccines and the drugs and take all the risk of what might happen to us and have zero liability, in fact, if that product even kills you, then something needs to change.
We are not allowed to know what information they have about the safety or the efficacy of it, and of course we cannot sue them. It goes to a vaccine court, which has paid out billions of dollars in damages. Stay with us. We're going to be right back with Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. And of course, she entered the news in a very big way in Australia when they tried to ban her from entering the country because she was going to talk about vaccines, about informed consent, about us having information, and about the necessity of having our consent do something to us. Now, this was reported in the Sydney Morning Sun on January the 7th. They had had an interview, as Dr. Tenpenny pointed out, on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's radio. And they said after that, there were calls to block her from entering Australia, to bar her from entering Australia, saying her beliefs are a threat to society. But Dr. Tenpenny responded, said, no, what I really am, and what all of us are, for the most part, are pro-information, pro-education, completely for freedom of choice and informed consent. So, Dr. Tenpenny, I want to talk to you in this segment. Let's talk about the laws that are already in place. You started to talk about that before, because I said I'm concerned about what they're going to do in terms of how they're going to actually implement and take and actually use these laws that they have put into place. I think they're preparing the public mentally with this scare over measles, a minor childhood disease that was never considered to be life-threatening, as we talked about. They've already put some laws in place, and a lot of laws are being proposed all over the country. Let's talk about some of those laws that are in place and the ones that are being proposed.
The one that was put into place in 1986 was the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And it was at that point in time that the pharmaceutical industry was getting sued left and right over the problems with the pertussis vaccine. Most of the drug companies that were creating vaccines went out of business, and several that were remaining went to then President Reagan and said, you've got to do something to protect us, or because this is the cornerstone of our public health and that we have to have vaccines, and without vaccines, humanity probably won't survive. And so they passed this law in 1986. Part of that law is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is the VAERS system. That is a passive collection of people who have had side effects. And the side effects can be anything from a sore arm all the way up to a death. Anybody can report a problem, and that's why the FDA doesn't take it very seriously. They just think it's anecdotal. Anybody can report a problem. Unless they see some serious trends, they don't pay any attention to it.
And I don't think most people know that that exists. I think there's a lot of stuff that's underreported because most people don't know that they could report these symptoms there. We didn't know about it with our children.
Exactly. And they actually have said that David Satcher, who was the Surgeon General at the time, said that less than 10% of adverse events are actually reported, whether that be a vaccine or a drug, less than 10%. So we know that about 12,000 VAERS reports are filed every year. And if that's only 10%, that could mean as many as 120,000 reactions, many of them serious, or go underreported because nobody knows to report them. And with that, we've paid almost $3 billion out in vaccine injury compensation claims, even though only 25% of people actually file a claim actually get compensation, and it can take years for that to happen.
How does that work out? How does that vaccine compensation work out when we can't sue the companies? It's a vaccine court, right?
Well, it's called the vaccine court, which is a federal court of claims where you file a claim. And if you are only 25% of the people who file the claim get any compensation. So, and there are many people who have an injury to the vaccine that don't even qualify to file for a report or file a claim, because there is a table. It's called the vaccine injury table that says these are the only types of side effects that we will allow compensation for. But what about all the other people that have serious lifelong complications that start outside the window of what the table lays out there, and they can't get any claim? They're just hazards of the system. They are just disposable people that they just sacrifice themselves for the greater good or their children, and there's no compensation. You can't sue the doctor, the hospital, the manufacturers, the government. You are just stuck with your lifelong of bad disease and no money to help you pay to get better.
So the vaccine court is another one of these nonsense courts, like the FISA court, like the traffic court, like the tax court, where you don't have any rights, you don't have any representation, you don't have a jury. It's just a whitewash for the industry.
It's an absolute kangaroo court. In fact, the people who are the judges, so to speak, they don't even call them judges. They call them special masters, and they are appointed. They have no medical background, and so they already, for the most part, are pro-vaccine. They listen to the pro-vaccine side of the equation, and they politely listen to the other side, and then say, "No, I don't think this has anything to do with it." There are very few cases for which that vaccines have been adjudicated in the favor of the.
We got to go to a break, Dr. Tenpenny. We're going to come back and talk about this more.
The knowledge of the ancients, tried and true, trusted herbs and extracts fused with the latest nutraceutical science. Introducing the all-new Ancient Defense Herbal Immunity Blend, crafted with over 14 key ancient herbs and extracts to supercharge and prepare your body for what experts admit is the most dangerous season of the year. We have rejected hundreds of other formulations in our quest to bring you what is simply the most powerful and comprehensive proprietary formula that we have ever created in the realm of herbal immunity. For the last 2 years, our team has been working with top doctors, nutritionists, and chemists to develop the ultimate nutraceutical formulation. Experience the benefits of combining over 14 ancient herbs and extracts with exciting new advances in nutraceutical science. For a limited time, get 25% off on this introductory offer. Visit ancientdefense.com or call 888-253-3139. ancientdefense.com.
We're going to go back to Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Her website is tenpennyimc.com. And we were just talking in the last segment about the history of the government's protection of the vaccine companies, going back to 1986, where Ronald Reagan removed the ability of people who suffer adverse effects from the drug companies' vaccines, removed their ability to sue the vaccine companies. Instead, they set up this kangaroo court with special masters who would allocate money based on people who have been injured on vaccines. You wouldn't have a real court, just like we don't have real courts for virtually anything anymore. Whether it's traffic court or whether it's the FISA court, it's just a kangaroo legal system that we have now, and most people don't even try, even in a criminal case, they don't even look for a jury trial because we've been lied to for so long about what juries are for. They feel that they would just cop to one of the pleas and avoid a trial altogether. But I think it's very important for us to talk to Dr. Tenpenny. Of course, they were very strident about shutting down her message in Australia. There were bomb threats when they were not able to bar her from entering the country. As the person who was working with her to get her to speak in Australia pointed out, Stephanie Messenger, she said, we can't get doctors in Australia to talk about the risk of vaccination because they've been warned by the medical board that they will be stricken from the register. In other words, they're going to lose their license to practice, just as lawyers who inform people in court about the true purpose of a jury, that you are there to judge not only the law, but the way it's being applied, not only the facts of the case, but the way the law is being applied, whether you agree with that law. If you are a lawyer and you tell that to a jury, most cases you're going to get disbarred. So It's a real war against information. That's why we talk about it as being the info war. It really is about information. And they don't want you to be informed, and they don't want your consent. And I want to go back to Dr. Tenpenny. I want to continue talking about the legal history of protecting the vaccine companies, as well as the things that they've already put in place to enact a kind of medical tyranny. Go ahead, Dr. Tenpenny. We were just talking about the vaccine court, and continue on with that and what they've done since then in terms of laws they put in that would force us to take vaccines.
Well, as if the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program in 1986 wasn't bad enough, it was in about 2004 that they passed something called Addendum E. And that's posted on my vaccine website, which is drtenpenny.com. And there is a downloadable PDF file that will be up there later today or in the next couple of days that I will share with all of the InfoWars listeners. And I wrote about it a lot in my book called Foul, Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think. And what Addendum E was the next level ramping up of complete protection for the pharmaceutical industry, that unless you could prove intent, that they were intending to create a product, either a vaccine or a drug, to kill you, and you died from this product, you had even less ability to have any sort of recourse than what the National Injury Compensation Program gave you. It was putting into place the fast tracking of vaccines and drugs if we needed them for a terrorism or a bioterrorism sort of activity. There was no compensation whatsoever. And the person who pushed that through was then Senator Fritz from Tennessee, who, again, was another Republican. And he wanted to push this through and gave complete protection to the pharmaceutical industry. It was tacked on at the end of a defense appropriation bill at the end of the session, when most of the people who were on the committee had already gone home for a Christmas break. And they swore that they were going to revisit this after they returned from the Christmas break, which they never did. And so that is already on the books to protect them from all liability going forward. The other thing that is now coming into play is all the laws that are being pushed forward in a very rapid, illogical fashion to revoke all of the exemptions that we have had in place since the early 1900s for the right to refuse vaccines. All 50 states have had a medical exemption. 48 states have had a religious exemption, with the exception of West Virginia and Mississippi. And we've had 20 states that have had what's called a philosophical exemption, which means you look at the risk of the vaccine and you compare it to the risk of the illness and say, I don't think so. I think I can keep my children healthy by other means. Well, since this whole measles nonsense has rolled forward, they are now fast tracking these bills all across the country. In fact, if you go to the nvicadvocacy.org website, which tracks all of these bills that are coming forward, you will see that there are anywhere between 3 and 5 bills in every state to repeal all rights to refuse. In fact, right before I came on the show today, I got an email that Washington State, which historically has had a philosophical exemption, and a couple of years ago they limited that and said that you have to, in order to get your philosophical exemption, you have to have an appointment with a doctor and go through an indoctrination episode. And now they have passed a law, passed a committee that's gone into full law to completely repeal all rights to refuse in the state of Washington. And this just happened just in the last 48 hours.
And that's really a sad thing because, well, we do have one piece of good news, and I'll pass this on to you. We've been contacted by Representative David Sawicki in Maine. He has sponsored a Maine House bill called My Body, My Choice. It's an act to make it illegal to require anyone to receive a vaccine against their free will. That is, though, the minority report. As you pointed out, in virtually all these states, we have a lot of bills that are being prepared to take away our exemption, as they call it. This is the way that they talk when they talk about, tax exemption, or they talk about a tax cut being an expenditure. In other words, all your money belongs to them unless they exempt it from being taken away. And then, of course, that's an expenditure. We are not allowed to have, as they're talking about in California, they say we want to eliminate the personal belief exemption. Of course, it's being pushed very heavily by the LA Times. Personal belief, that's what we used to call information, being informed. And then an exemption is what we used to say was consent. But now they have completely twisted this around. I think it's also interesting, Dr. Tenpenny, as you pointed out, the connections between Ronald Reagan, who put in the protection from being sued in 1986, and then the representative who pushed in this 2004 addendum to remove even more liability from the pharmaceutical companies, also being a Republican. I think it's very interesting when we look at how Megyn Kelly of Fox News comes in and says, well, yeah, it's Big Brother, but sometimes you need Big Brother. You know when you need Big Brother? It's when the guy who owns your network, Rupert Murdoch, has a son who's been sitting on the board for a number of years on GlaxoSmithKline. When you're intimately tied into the pharmaceutical industry, when they pay for most of the commercials that you put on your network, that's when you have to have Big Brother, when you got to force people to buy products from your corporate sponsors. And I find that we're in a very dangerous situation right here, because we know that the GOP is very closely linked to the pharmaceutical company and industry, and we know that the Democrats love the idea of mandates, and so they're pushing for this everywhere. This is a very concerning time, Dr. Tenpenny. I think they've got a really good chance of putting this through unless we get some kind of a coalition that goes across these political lines that breaks this kind of mindset that we need to mandate things and breaks this connection of crony capitalism that's rampant in the Republican Party.
Back in 2010, there was a policy that came out. It was called the Healthy People 2020 policy. And they've been doing this every 10 years to push forth public health agendas. And it started in the 80s, and every 10 years they evaluated where they had moved this public health agenda moving forward. And in 2010, there was this big celebratory thing that happened, because the next 10 years between 2010 and 2020 was going to be the year to push forward all of these vaccine mandates, to disallow people the right to refuse, to make as an obligation of employment for in the healthcare industry, not only nurses and doctors, but anybody else that works in healthcare, including people in the IT department and volunteers, in order to have not only a flu shot, but all of the vaccines that have been approved by the ACIP, the approval committee, that they should have all of these vaccines and be up to date on all of them as a requirement for employment. That was part of these Healthy People 2020 rules. So what we're seeing now in terms of taking away the exemptions, pushing the flu shots on healthcare workers, the next phase will be the additional shots like the pneumonia shot and all of those things. There's another policy statement that just came out on the 15th of February, which is an entire vaccine agenda pushing towards adolescents and adults, somewhere between 20 and 30 more vaccines in that schedule. And this is where we're going. If people don't understand that the right to refuse is not about the measles shot, it's not about whether you're a bad parent, whether or not you get your kids a couple of these vaccines. It's about what is barreling down the track at us in a very near future. And I would maintain that many of the very leftist or very liberal pro-vaccine, rabid pro-vaccine people that don't even understand that what is coming down on them, they may not want to have a shot that requires them to get something for obesity or depression or for periodontal disease or for their high blood pressure. And they may not have a right to refuse that.
Yeah, we have a full-scale medical tyranny. As you pointed out, this is a plan they had in place, talking about how they're going to roll this out between 2010 and 2020. Here we are at the midpoint, and they're putting all the legislation in place. This is something I just don't understand. I know there's a knee-jerk reaction amongst many on the left to give all power to the state, to force people to do stuff. But as you point out, can't they see where this is headed in a full-scale medical tyranny? I just don't understand their mindset.
And not only will it become about vaccines, I mean, when they first started mandating flu shots for healthcare workers about 3 years ago, I had seen this coming for 5 or 6 years before that. And I said, where is this going to stop? That they require someone to be injected with a substance against their will that's not like a B12 shot or a vitamin shot. It's something that can cause them serious harm, in some cases even cause them to die. And the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program in the last 2 years has paid out more compensation for people people injured by the flu shot than for any other vaccine. And I think it's because they're requiring so many people to have it. So where are we going to stop with that? Is it going to be all the vaccines? Is it going to be if you're having a bad day, you're required to have your Prozac? If your cholesterol level normal is less than 200 and yours is 201, you must take your Lipitor, you will be denied health insurance. Yeah. Are we going to be required to have these things to get on an airplane, to renew our driver's license, to go into a liquor store to prove that we can be out in public? I mean, where is this tyranny going to stop?
Full-scale control. You won't be able to travel. You won't be able to work. We've already seen this happen to the medical community. We've seen have many people who call in. We ask people to call in and tell us about the adverse reactions that they've had to vaccines. And, of course, we're going to be taking calls on that and on anything else you'd like to call in the next hour. I'll be giving that number out later on. But people will call in and say, I had to take this because I was in the military. I had to take it because I was a healthcare worker. They're going to extend that to everybody. They're not going to, as you pointed out, they're not going to let you travel. They're not going to let your kids get into school. They're going to essentially quarantine you out of society with this kind of medical tyranny. And of course, they're not going to stop there. They will kick the door down at some point and come in and shoot you with a vaccine if you don't shoot them with a gun first. That's where it's really going to come down to. So we really need to fight this at this point. We need to wake up to what is the logical result of this. And Dr. Tenpenny, I think that we look at this and we say, look at the precedents that they're establishing, the way that they are setting the public up with their mindset, just talking about this measles thing, and we know that's just a small part of it. That's not really the full agenda. They're just using that right now. We've been talking about fluoridating the water for a long time. Whether you believe what we're saying about our health concerns about that or not, how do you ever justify mass medicating the public through the water supply for anything? You can't control the dosage when you put it into the water supply. We have legitimate dosages for anything. So you have a child who is maybe, you don't know what kind of level that they're going to get because you can't control the concentration of that when you just dump it into the water supply. They might get something that is many times higher than you would give to an adult male. So that's what we're concerned about. If you establish that as a principle, and that's what this is all about. That's what this measles epidemic is about, that they're talking about forcing people to take vaccines. They establish these precedents of mass medication, of taking away your informed consent. And they've got some things down the line that we should all be very concerned about, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, left or right.
Oh, absolutely. And not only do they have all the fluoride in the water, but there have been several studies that have come out now showing all of the pharmaceuticals that are in the water.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, there's no real filters out there to be able to filter out all these different pharmaceuticals because some of them are really small molecules. Some of them are very large molecules. And so we're getting our dose of daily Prozac in our tap water every day.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that with the fish. They talk about how the fish are behaving strangely and reacting to these SSRI drugs because, as you pointed out, the water systems are not filtering that out. The water treatment systems are not set up to filter those pharmaceuticals out. So they're accumulating and building in the water supply.
And even with children with vaccines, with this one-size-fits-all vaccination policy that is only set up for the convenience of doctor visits and the insurance company, that they are to get these vaccines at birth, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 1 year, and pre-kindergarten. It's all set up on that schedule at the convenience of the insurance industry. And all the vaccines are given at the same dose at the same way. So it doesn't matter if you are a 6-pound premature baby or if you're a 12-pound baby, you get the same dose. And the same thing happens all the way up the scale. There's another thing that not very many people know about is about half of the vaccines when you get the little vial and there's the gray stopper at the top that you put the needle through. In about half of the vaccines, that is a very inert rubber. It's a gray rubber that's very inert, causes no side effects, no reactions. In another half of the vaccines, those rubber stoppers are still contain large amounts of latex. So they sensitize people to latex through that rubber stopper. And because you don't know which one of those that you're getting, unless you know the manufacturer, you may be getting a lot of sensitization to latex, which increases your incidence of asthma and allergies, increases your reaction to foods. And all of these things are happening behind the scenes to confuse people so that they're not getting all of the same vaccine. Because if we were all getting all the same vaccine and it was dose related to our age and to our weight, and we're taking into consideration things like family history and whether your parents had a vaccine reaction, we would have a completely different conversation. But instead, it's this militant tyranny to make sure we were all inoculated with all of these substances.
That's very interesting because latex allergies were essentially, I'd never heard of that before I became an adult just a couple of decades ago. Now it's fairly prevalent, and it's amazing to see how these different things like that, like autism, as you pointed out, we can't get that. They're not interested in studying it or in terms of releasing those studies to us, but they also, by putting some of them out with an inert rubber and putting some of them out with a latex, it confuses it. It muddies the water. We can't get a good epidemiological study about the real effects of this, and I think it's deliberate. I think I picked up that you believe that it's deliberate too, don't you, Dr. Tenpenny?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Everything we said came true. Everything we've done's been right.
We're talking to Dr. Tenpenny, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. She was kept out of Australia because they didn't want people to hear her message about informed consent, her questioning of the safety and the efficacy of the vaccines. In the last segment, we were talking about how the government has moved to protect the vaccine companies from litigation. What does that tell you? What does it tell you that they have to be protected from being sued? What does it tell you that they want to demand that you be forced to take their products? Shouldn't you demand to be informed? Shouldn't you demand that they have to get your consent? Shouldn't you demand your rights? And as you pointed out, though, we've got bills pretty much in every state that are coming out to force mandated vaccines, to remove our informed consent. Dr. Tenpenny, tell us where we can get information from you. You're a wealth of information. You've got you've got several different websites here. Tell us where we can go to get more information.
Well, one closing comment, David, that I think is really important is that the politicians in your state and the politicians in Washington only care about two things. They care about votes and they care about money. And right now we are really in a fight for our life. It's a race to the finish line to protect our rights on a state level. And so every one of your listeners really needs to go to nvicadvocacy.org, get signed up for your own states, start letting people know that you've got to protect your right to refuse, not only what is on the schedule today, but what's coming. For more information from me, you can get that at drtenpenny.com, which is dr10penny, just like it sounds, .com. My Facebook page is Dr. Tenpenny on vaccines. And I have another site that's called the Vaccine Research Library, which is vaccineresearchlibrary.com, where we've collected more than 6,500 mainstream medical articles that show problems associated with vaccines. You can sign up there for free for 2 weeks, get information about MMR, aluminum, and pertussis, and hopefully spread the word that vaccines are not safe, they're not effective, they don't protect you, and they do cause harm.
And we'll have those links on the YouTube video of this interview. That'll be on the Alex Jones YouTube channel. And if you're not a subscriber to our YouTube channel, please become a subscriber. You'll see these videos as they come up. You'll be able to find these links to these different groups. And, of course, we would ask that you support our operation by subscribing to Prison Planet TV, where you'll get the nightly news each night and be able to share that with 20 people. Now, the one that is talking about the bills that are being introduced in all the different states. Let me repeat that one again, Dr. Tenpenny. That's nvicadvocacy.org. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And when you go there for your particular state and you register, you will only get alerts about your state. So you're not going to be inundated. If you're in Pennsylvania, you're not going to know about Oklahoma. So you're just going to know about the states that are very important to you. And they will tell you, this is a good bill. Encourage your representatives to vote for this one. This is a bad bill. It's going to take away your rights. Encourage your representatives to vote no on this bill. This is the most urgent point in time we've ever had with this issue. Everyone who cares about their freedom, about what's going on with their lives, the lives of their children and your grandchildren, you must get involved. You must get involved.
That's very important. And I think we can have much more effect at the local, at the state level. People knowing what is coming up in their particular state, being able to go in. I think the people who are concerned about this, the people who are informed about this, the people who demand that they have individual liberty, those are people who will really stand up and fight in most cases because they're looking at this issue. They understand the threat that it is to their freedoms. They understand the threat that it is to their health, to the life of themselves and their families. And I think if they can network together, that's very important. We need to not only just stop the bad bills that are going to remove our informed consent, but we need to put it in law, as this representative in Maine, the My Body, My Choice, as he put it, an act to make it illegal to require anyone to receive a vaccine against their free will. What's so controversial about that? That ought to be the default position in America. Unfortunately, it isn't. We're going to have to fight. Thank you so much, Dr. Tenpenny, for the information, for your efforts, and we'll have those links for those various sites up on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us.